Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I apologise that for those of you who came last time, you only saw a disembodied figure and disembodied voice, me on the screen. And also I apologise to those of you who so liked the film of me last time that you're disappointed that you've got me in the flesh. But there we are, I am here, and I'm very pleased to be here, and I'm really pleased to be continuing this extraordinary odyssey that Gresham have allowed me to go on over the last few years, following the extraordinary history of English architecture. It seems like a long time ago that I started with the Anglo-Saxons, and we've now reached the interwar years. My disembodied lecture really was focused on the First World War, and I want to start again with the First World War this evening, just to position ourselves and get ourselves into the mood for what followed. So the First World War, of course, killed 8 million people. It shattered the Victorian age, and you know, it was a particularly traumatic issue because England had not been in a major war since the defeat of Napoleon, and those who had sort of imagined riding to victory in shining breastplates were appalled to end up in a muddy network of trenches that, if stretched out in a long line, would have wound their way once round the globe. 7,000 young men were killed every day in the trenches, while only 70 miles away, across the Channel, people still went to the theatre and smoked cigars. The young archaeologist Mortimer Wheeler, who was a director of this museum, which I was some years ago, he recalled in his autobiography this. He said, "Those familiar only with the mild casualties of the Second German War can have little appreciation of the carnage which marked its predecessor. It is a typical instance, that of 5 university students who worked together in the Roxeter excavations of 1913, only one survived the war. It so happened that that survivor was myself." The survivors, like Sir Mortimer Wheeler and their families, wanted something different from post-war Britain. But the new direction that Britain took was rather a different one than that taken by the French and Germans. It was a gentler, it was a more conservative way, because between the wars, Britain neither broke with its past, nor, I would suggest, was in its thrall. It accommodated it, it modernised it, it redesigned it to make it part of everyday life. Modernism and the Avant-Garde. Is that all right? It's not right for me, I can tell you. Modernism and the Avant-Garde. If I say Avant-Garde, it makes a horrible noise. Such an important cultural feature of France, Germany, or Russia played, I'm going to suggest, a very little part in interwar Britain. The arts and crafts movement, which I touched on in my last lecture, was alive but was now democratised. Millions shared in the country cottage, the countryside, the homely comfort of old England. Modernity in Britain was conservative, it was comfortable, it was cautious, it wasn't angular, jarring and reactionary. And this is the key to the title of my lecture this evening. Forwards or backwards? Which way was Britain to go after the First World War? Or would it, as I've already hinted, somehow find a way in between? So forwards or backwards was, in fact, the key dilemma in the interwar world of art and architecture. Let me put it in the words of the time. For them, the dilemma was traditionalism versus modernism, or again, as some put it, internationalism versus vernacularism. And all this was very neatly expressed by the then father of English painting, Paul Nash, a confirmed modernist who worked in a native tradition. He was to ask in 1922, and I quote, "whether it is possible to go modern and still be British. The battle lines have been drawn up. Internationalism versus indigenous culture. Renovation versus conservatism. The industrial versus the pastoral. The functional versus the futile." So what were, in fact, these two choices?
Well, modernism, of course, was seen to embrace new materials and innovative technology. It was seen as searching for a radical new visual language based on abstract, non-representational forms and minimal decoration, as well as, I think, a sort of engagement with what were thought to be universal design qualities rather than very specific ones. And the approach is perhaps best expressed in a very well-known modernist building, the Lawn Road Flats in Hampstead, sometimes known as the Isokon building. It's a block of 32 ultra-efficient flats. Now, many of you will have walked past this building. It still survives, recently been renovated. Many of you will not have been inside. The rooms inside were extremely small, and deliberately so. They were just large enough for a couple, but they were better off, really, for a single person. And this was a daring concept in itself, especially if that single person was, God forbid, a woman. So this was not a place for traditional families. And the interiors were deliberately very hard to personalise. The furniture and the fittings were all supplied as part of the package. This was designed for living without possessions. There wasn't even really anywhere to put your possessions. There was no mantelpiece or anything, the sort of traditional thing that you'd have expected. The building was designed by Wells Coates, a man without any formal architectural training. He was an engineer. So, this is the first choice for artists and architects, the choice to turn modern. The alternative was to continue in what should be called the historicist vein. In other words, architecture that took its lead from past historical styles. As I explained in my last lecture, before the First World War, this was a style called arts and crafts, or sometimes called Queen Anne. It was a funny sort of amalgam of things partially Tudor and partially a revival of the time of Sir Christopher Wren. But in its essence, it was a revolt against the standardisation and the mechanisation of industrialisation. And this is where I'm going to start this evening, as this was the established look that people were interested in and against which the proponents of modern styles reacted. A historian and architect called J. Alfred Gotch was the first person to write a learned account of Tudor architecture in England. It was a book published in 1901. It was called Early English Renaissance Architecture. And this expanded on an earlier book that he'd done of photographs and drawings that covered Elizabethan and Jacobean buildings. Gotch's contemporary was a man called Thomas Garner, who at exactly the same time was compiling an even larger and even more ambitious project on the Tudor houses of England. He died, and an architect and lecturer at King's College called Arthur Stratton took up his research and notes. And what he did, based on Garner's work, was published this absolutely huge book. I've got a copy of it at home. It's 2 volumes. It's this big, and it's that fat, each volume. I mean, it's absolutely gargantuan book. And this was published in 1911. It could only be published by a list of subscribers. People subscribed to these volumes. And almost every single major architect of the day can be found in that list of subscribers at the front, including Edwin Lutyens, C.R. Ashby, W.D. Carrow, and many, many others. And the book starts off in its introduction with the following, and I'm just going to read to you what it says. One of the chief reasons that make this particular period of such supreme importance is that the house building is indigenous to this soil. It is as national as the name with which it is stamped. It breathes the restful yet vigorous spirit of the time that gave its birth, and with all is characterised by a semi-contained homeliness, redolent of the life and customs of the Englishman of the day, and impossible to be either originated or imitated by its continental contemporaries. This was an incredibly nationalistic view of English architecture, one that was incredibly powerful, particularly after the First World War, when England wanted to express its difference from the countries elsewhere in Europe. And this view that Tudor architecture somehow grew out of the soil of England and expressed the soul of England was also the view of a large number of architects and private house owners, particularly the very rich, who, about the time of the First World War, turned to the Tudor style in force. This Tudor mania led to the restoration of many old houses, many which were originally ruins. So, Ightham Moat, almost completely ruined when it was taken over and restored to be a Tudor house. Sissinghurst, also a ruin, taken over, of course, by Vita Sackville West in Kent. Ockwells in Berkshire, Athelhampton in Dorset, Avebury in Wiltshire. These just are a small number of a large number of Tudor projects that took place in the period after the First World War up to 1939. There were also some new houses like Bailiff's Court in Sussex, which was built for Walter Guinness. And in this example, as in many of the previous ones I've just shown you, genuine Tudor buildings were dismantled and reincorporated into the new structures. Well, just as Tudor architecture had become admired, so at exactly the same time was a revival in the interest of the architecture of Sir Christopher Wren. Now, Wren, of course, today is sort of universally acknowledged as one of the great sort of English geniuses, and so it's really hard for us to imagine that he went through a period of being really not admired at all. But around 1800, the tide of taste had really seriously turned against Christopher Wren, and by the 1840s, people thought he was really, really unfashionable. His palace at Hampton Court was characterised, and I'm quoting here, as a national misfortune and an impertinent construction. His Ionic colonnade in the clock court was a symbol of desecration, and Wren was described as one of the many men ruined by the madness for classical. The inner quadrangle, or fountain court at Hampton Court, was described in 1849 as sombre and melancholic, the ordinary result of narrow spaces enclosed with lofty buildings on every side, dribbling fountains and little fishes who were the prisoners of the state. But the growing appreciation of Wren's genius had begun relatively soon after, with the publication of his first biography in 1823 by James Elmes, The Life and Work of Christopher Wren. And 10 years later, C.R. Cockerell, the first professional president of the Institute of British Architects, was the first major architect of the 19th century to admire Wren's life and architecture. And in 1838, he painted this astonishing painting, a tribute to the memory of Christopher Wren. This huge watercolour, it's about this big, with showing all Wren's major works, all in one view. Of course, you'd never see that view, thank goodness. But they were all laid out there together. A man called John Clayton was inspired by this extraordinary watercolour, and he produced the first major study of Wren's city churches in 1848, which he in fact dedicated to Cockerell. By the 1860s, there was anyway a fading of the evangelical fervour that had characterised the Gothic revival, and it was giving way to something much more English, something much more compromising, and something much more secular in this admiration for Christopher Wren, which at the time was described as Queen Anne. It was all about soft red brick, enlivened with beautifully cut white Portland stone dressings. And one of the first houses built in this style is not a house that has seen much. It's a place called Kinmel Park in Denbighshire, and is a house that was directly inspired, actually, by Sir Christopher Wren's Hampton Court. It was built for a man called H.R. Hughes, who'd made an extraordinary sum of money from copper mining. His architect was William Eden Nesfield, with whom he had a deepening friendship, and together they went to Hampton Court to look at the building to get some inspiration. And if you ignore these huge French roof line here, which was deliberately put on to compensate for what was often felt as Wren's rather boring roof line at Hampton Court. But everything below that looks very, very much like Wren's buildings on the east front at Hampton Court. But this is a building built in the middle of Wales. If it had been in Surrey, it probably would have been very influential. But in the end, the big champion of the English Baroque revival was Nesfield's assistant, John McKean Bryden, who in a series of brilliant lectures and articles argued for a revival of classical architecture as epitomised by Sir Christopher Wren. And from the late 19th century, a small group of buildings pioneers that style. Bryden's own building of Chelsea Town Hall in the late 1880s. John Shaw's Wellington College. And you can really see Hampton Court in that, can't you? French roofs, again, to try and get away from the problem that Wren had with his very flat parapets. The municipal buildings in Leicester, also built in the late 19th century. And certainly by the turn of the century, Reginald Blomfield was publishing his book, A History of Renaissance Architecture in England, the crescendo of which was the work of Sir Christopher Wren, who he characterised as the most English of English architects. And so you have this extraordinary coming together in exactly the same period, around the First World War, of a conviction that Tudor architecture was uniquely English, and that the architecture of Sir Christopher Wren was uniquely English. And so in the early years of the 20th century, this architecture of Wren gives birth to a whole spectrum of public and private buildings led by a group of Edwardian architects who sometimes are known as the men who are working in the Renaissance, as in W-R-E-N, Renaissance style. And it's probably worth just listing a few and just showing you a few pictures of these buildings so you can get a feel of what these were like. So Blomfield himself, who'd written the great book extolling the virtues of Wren, builds Moundsmere House in Hampshire, immediately before the First World War, for Wilfrid Buckley. Pretty extravagant but very elegant, tightly controlled building. His cousin, A.C. Blomfield, rebuilt Stansted Park in Sussex. Still pretty big, pretty handsome house. In the field of public architecture, some of the big buildings on Whitehall, some of the new government offices in Whitehall, in Scotland Yard. Commercial buildings were also used. Bentl's Store. Do you know Bentl's Store in Kingston? Looks very much like Hampton Court, actually, spookily, which is right next door. Designed by Sir Aston Webb, 1931 to 5. And it wasn't only polite architecture. It wasn't only big public buildings, commercial buildings, country houses. It was also used in quite humble housings. This is a Peabody estate, a philanthropic housing development at Cleverley in Hammersmith, 1928, by Victor Wilkins. And you see how this motif here, which comes from Hampton Court, is incredibly popular. You just see, look, there it is again. It was used again and again in these buildings. And these round windows here, very, very popular. Again, all seen very much as part of Christopher Wren's contribution. And just as contemporary architects rediscovered Wren's architecture, so they also discovered his interiors. And interior decoration developed a fascination for this period, this early 18th century period. For instance, the 6th Duke of Devonshire at Chatsworth House in 1811 had regarded these state apartments, which we now find so magnificent, as deeply unfashionable. He called them ponderous and dismal, and he said that they rather uncomfortably reminded him of that terrible place, Hampton Court. And so he and his architect, Sir Geoffrey Wyatville, great Gothicizing architect, originally planned a complete modernisation of them. But all this had changed by the 1920s, when the wife of the 9th Duke set out with the help of her architect to disguise the effect of Wyatville's works and reintroduce the Tudor interiors. And so when you look in this room here, the china closet, the original corner fireplace, very characteristic of Wren's work, had been taken out by the Victorians and was put back in again in the 20s in a homage to Sir Christopher Wren. But this interest in 17th century architecture and 16th and 17th century architecture was not just an upper-class obsession. It was a middle-class obsession too, but one very mixed up with a newly found passion for the countryside. By the First World War, the incredibly intense urbanisation of the previous century had ground to a halt, and people were falling over each other to get out of the towns and get into the countryside. Cities began to bleed out into the surrounding countryside as landowners sold farmland for new suburbs, laid out in an open and generous way. Suburbs tried hard to be villages in layout, in road names, in architecture, in gardens, open space and planting. Villages, meanwhile, tried even harder to be villages. The first village name signs were erected on the Sandringham estate by Edward VII, starting a rural tradition that quickly seemed as if it had always been there. You probably never thought about that when village signs first started, but Edward VII invented it to promote rural tourism in his rooms. You may be interested to know that the village sign at Dersingham is a new one, which I unveiled about 3 weeks ago, so that's in my mind at the moment. Pubs which in the late 19th century had been characterised by incredibly garish, brightly coloured enamel metal signs, lost all those and acquired traditional hanging pub signs and names. Tea shops, cafes, even petrol stations, as I will go on to describe, were camouflaged to look like old-world fixtures in villages to which they came. The countryside after the First World War was deluged by visitors, in trains, in buses, in cars, in bikes and on foot. And increasingly, workers were given long holidays. And this meant that by 1937, 15 million English people, about a third of the population, were taking an annual holiday. This was new after the First World War. It wasn't available to workers in the Victorian period. Cars were, at first, not a means of business conveyance, they were a leisure accessory. Just think how nice that would be. Early motor magazines didn't focus on the mechanics of cars, how fast they could go, your V8 engines. They focused on where to take your cars, where to go in them, where to drive on them, how to enjoy them. And as a result, the market was flooded with guidebooks aimed for the motor tourist. In 1907, James Edmund Vincent, a distinguished Times journalist and former editor of Country Life, wrote a book called Through East Anglia in a Motor Car. One of the very first books written especially for motor touring. He announced in his introduction, and I quote, "A new method of travel, in fact, brings in its train the need for a new species of guidebook." And he recognised that for the first time, the principal enjoyment of a day out was not reaching the destination, it was getting there. And the tour was the thing. That's what people wanted. People wanted to go on a tour. And his guidebook gave advice on routes and roads, even the best place while you were driving around Norfolk to buy a pair of driving gloves. Ordnance survey maps were stuffed into the glove pockets of hundreds of thousands of touring cars. And in 1924, the Ordnance Survey Archaeological Officer, O.G.S. Crawford, under his own steam, published the map of Roman Britain. The Daily Mail described it as one of the most wonderful maps ever made. And it claimed that it would open up a complete new era in motor touring. It sold out. And very quickly, the Ordnance Survey produced more period maps, opening up archaeological remains to tourists everywhere. More specialised books help visitors get to remote Neolithic long barrows and stone circles. There was an extraordinary organisation called the Homeland Association. No one's heard of it today. Very, very popular in the years after 1914. The Homeland Association was founded to encourage knowledge and love of Britain. And it published a range of guidebooks. In 1930 came a guide to prehistoric Sussex. This was completely impossible before the First World War because you could never have got the prehistoric monuments. Some visitors wandering around prehistoric Sussex may have had in their pocket Our Homeland's Prehistoric Antiquities and How to Study Them, published in 1922. So there was a great influx of people into the countryside. Perhaps the most successful of all the motoring guides were the Shell guides, published by Shell and written by very prominent people, including, as you see here, John Betjeman, who was the series editor. So, in short, the countryside after the First World War was full of people wanting to go places and see things. During the First World War, there were 331 stage bus operators. By 1930, there were 3,962, and by 1932, buses carried more passengers than the entire rail network. At the same time, there was an explosion in car ownership. In 1918, there'd been no more than 100,000 private motor cars, but by 1939, there were 2 million. The internal combustion engine took people to places that railways and even motor buses couldn't. The countryside, its towns, its villages, its monuments were now for the first time permeable to almost everybody. Now, the effects of this were very considerable. And for a few moments, I need to turn to an entirely new category of architecture, which emerged very strongly after 1914, which were buildings for the motor car. Now, for those people wanting to buy one of these new-fangled devices, the first car showrooms were set up in carriage repositories and occasionally in normal town centre shops. But in the years around the First World War, interest was growing in the design of purpose-built car showrooms. Indeed, in the streets around Great Portland Street in London, by 1914, there were already 29 showrooms selling cars. Here's one of them. And if you actually wander around Great Portland Street, quite a number of shops, and particularly restaurants, are actually built in former car showrooms. After the First World War, the London car dealers moved from Great Portland Street into Clubland, in St James's, because they thought that that is where people who would want to buy cars were. Some of you who are rich and fashionable enough may have been to the Wolseley restaurant, the headquarters of Wolseley Motor Company. Here it is, one of the grandest and earliest and most important car showrooms in England. It is designed by Curtis Green, a very, very good firm, who I mentioned in my last lecture, in 1922. These giant Corinthian columns here, and down below, very elaborate wrought ironwork, which led into the showroom. Originally, those of you who've been in there since it's been a restaurant know what the interior looks like. Originally, these columns, these Doric columns, this vaulted space, were red lacquer. So they were very, very striking structures. It's very interesting that the earliest car showrooms were deliberately traditional in style. They were trying to be reassuring. Here was new technology. It was not tried, it was not tested, and in order to sell this stuff, they wanted to create an environment that would have been reassuring and familiar to the gentlemen who left their St James's Club after several glasses of claret and port at lunchtime and viewing Wolseley motor cars, thinking of buying them. At this time, also, I think cars were being advertised and sold not on technical specifications, rather like I was saying with the magazines, but on their elegance and sophistication as leisure machines. And as we leave the 1920s and move into the 1930s, these very sort of traditional type of showrooms give way to buildings in a much more modern style. This is in Liverpool. There's a street called Bold Street in Liverpool. It's now, it was still a shopping street. It's a bit run down now, but in the 1930s, this was the exclusive end of Liverpool. And here you see a car showroom designed in the 1930s, again in the modern style, selling cars off the back of their design rather than their tradition. People who bought cars at first tended to store them in existing stables or carriage houses, because the first people who owned cars generally were quite well off. Gradually, a market developed in timber motor houses, as they were called, and you could buy them off the peg. You can see this is an advertisement, I think, from Country Life. But it was only eventually in the 1920s when new-built houses in the suburbs were given garages. I apologise for this photograph, which is really bad. But what it shows is one of these half-timbered houses. The slope comes down here, and there is an integral garage at that point there. So from the 1920s, garages actually built into houses themselves. And for those living in towns, car parks were very often put underground. Here is the colossal block of flats, Dolphin Square, in Westminster, built in 1935 to 7, a development of 1,236 flats, and it had a colossal car park underneath. The whole of this area under here is excavated out and is a car park for the residents of these buildings. It was simply assumed that if you lived in a stylish and fashionable flat like this, you would own a car. But these garages actually made only a very minor impact on the appearance of English towns and villages before 1939. What did actually make, I think, quite a substantial difference was the need to park cars away from home. Londoners alone already owned more than 40,000 cars in 1910, and of course, they wanted to use them to drive round town. Large car parks were consequently built before the Second World War in seaside towns, in city centres, at railway stations, and at entertainment venues. The model was the stable, thousands of which were crammed into city centres to accommodate hundreds of thousands of horses. Like stables, early city centre garages were multi-storey. Now, I'm not sure whether I've covered this in previous lectures. I can't cover everything, but because of the incredible pressure to have horses in the centre of London, most big stables were on 2 or perhaps even 3 levels. Just to give you an example, if you go to Paddington Station, you're standing in front of the station looking at it. On your right, there's some red brick buildings. Those buildings were built as multi-storey stables for the General Post Office so that they could redistribute letters. And there is at least one multi-storey stable still in use. If you go and walk along Whitehall, just around the back of Scotland Yard, the police have got a very nice 19th century double-decker stable in which the horses are kept. And so when cars needed to be accommodated, in central London, to begin with, they were looking at these multi-storey stables. The first ones, though, incorporated lifts and turntables. So if you look at the Bluebird Garage on the King's Road, very important building actually, it's now a restaurant also, again, if you visit there, you can dine in one of the earliest multi-storey car parks in England. There were lifts and turntables. But it was realised that actually ramps would be cheaper, they'd be faster to operate, and they'd be more reliable. And the first ramps were put in. The Bluebird Garage had ramps, and the place where you can see the really early ones here are in Soho. This is the Brewer Street car park in Soho. And as a complete aside, I remember in 2005 being responsible for listing this building, and most listings are just ticked through by ministers without realising what they're doing most of the time. This one came to the notice of Tessa Jowell, who was then Secretary of State, and I remember being hauled up before her and her blowing me up, saying, what the hell was I doing listing a multi-storey car park in Brewer Street? Well, the answer is it is the first major surviving car park which still contains its early ramps. Now, there's a little bit of trivia for you for the future. So by this date, and we're talking about, this one is built in 1930, by this date, repair and maintenance garages were also beginning to become a common sight in rural areas and in towns. Initially, these garages were just built in converted or pretty rudely built roadside structures. But the city centre ones started to become quite big. This is a rare surviving one. Again, I'm afraid my photograph's not great. This is Hamilton Motors. It's now called Exotic Cars. It's on Edgware Road, and it's a very early example of a repair and maintenance garage, which also had a showroom and would have had turntables and lifts to get cars upstairs. And during the 1930s, these garages became much bigger and much more sophisticated, because what started to happen was the dozens of different car manufacturers tended to amalgamate, tended to combine, and there were a much smaller range of cars on the road. And what this meant was that the garages were able to adopt a much more sort of streamlined sort of production line approach to car maintenance. At the same time, cars started looking less like carriages and began to look much sleeker. And so the design of these garages became sleek too. Here is the Tower Garage, now Maranello Ferrari. On the Egham bypass, next time you're driving past, slow down. It's a very early one, built in 1935. This is when garages started to look like the cars that they were selling. They were selling people a dream of modernity, a dream of the stylish lines that were in the cars, and the buildings were designed to match. And it's very, very typical of these buildings, and I'll show you some more examples later, with the combination, and I think I mentioned this in my last lecture when I was talking about underground stations, of the horizontal cut by the vertical. That is very, very characteristic of these early modernist buildings. Petrol stations, likewise, tended, until the late 1930s, to be very sort of vernacular. Here is a very early station, still amazingly in operation in Worcestershire, very dark, deep countryside there. Generally speaking, they tried to blend in with the style of the buildings round about. And they were able to do this because before 1939, all petrol stations were owner-occupied. The big oil companies hadn't bought the petrol station sites and owned them and introduced standardised signs, which is what happens after the Second World War. And so every petrol station you went to looked different because it was owned by a different person. And very often they tried to look like sort of half-timbered stables, or they were set in gardens with lots of flowers around them. It was still this wonderful, elegant period of motoring where it was all about leisure rather than being busy and trying to get somewhere quickly. Now, I'm not going to apologise for having spent quite a lot of time looking at the architecture of early motoring, because I think it really helps make my central point this evening. The car was a fundamentally modern, forward-looking piece of technology, but it was used, at first, to look backwards, to gain access to the countryside, to gain access to ancient monuments on hilltops, and almost exclusively until the late 1930s, the architecture that was used in connection with the car was also deeply traditional. You see, the countryside was being invaded by a new type of person. These weren't landowners or tenants. They were town and city dwellers looking for something that they saw as being part of their national identity. People wanted the security, the familiarity of the images that were encapsulated by half-timbered houses, half-timbered petrol stations, with leaded window panes. The interwar years were marked by fundamental, rapid changes, deep economic insecurity, and national self-questioning. And the countryside and its buildings provided an extraordinary sense of reassurance. And a major effect of this was the garden city. Now, the garden city was a concept invented by a single man, Ebenezer Howard, but it was one that found instant approval because of the ideas that I've just been talking about. Howard wanted to design a new type of place to live in, based, I think, broadly on the model industrial villages of the late 19th century, such as Saltaire, built by the industrialist Sir Titus Salt for his workers in his mills in Yorkshire, but particularly, I think, Port Sunlight on the Wirral west bank of the Mersey, built by the Lever family and named after their most successful product, Sunlight soap. These settlements were developments that got workers away from the brutal terraces that had characterised most of the new industrial towns, such as Middlesbrough, which you see here. What it did was allowed workers to live in traditional buildings in rural settlements. I mean, there's sort of no comparison between the two, is there really? What was different, though, about the garden suburbs is that they were funded by their inhabitants and not by their employees. The first to be built was Letchworth Garden Suburb, followed by Hampstead Garden Suburb, which you see a photograph here from the air. These housing developments, about which I could give an entire lecture, were important because they presented a view of England and of English architecture that was essentially rural, vernacular, and native. The types of houses were Tudor or Queen Anne. A few were Neo-Georgian, like the ones I'm showing you here, and they were laid out amidst trees and parks. This was the counter-urban. This was quasi-rural. And the architectural styles that are being used are the styles that I talked about at the start, Tudor, this Christopher Wren style, styles that were believed to be uniquely English. This was a recreation of the English countryside in the town. But these rural values expressed in the garden cities were a political mantra too. Stanley Baldwin, the dominating political figure of the interwar years, who you see here in a very early radio broadcast, clearly saw the importance of England's rural heritage. The First World War had had a transforming effect on his outlook and opinions, and indeed on his political career. He was too old to fight, in 1916, with a healthy inheritance, he turned to politics with a determination to serve his country in a different capacity. In an important speech in 1931, he laid out his motivations for entering politics. He said that after 4 years of slaughter and destruction, many times 4 years would be needed to repair even part of what had been lost. And after such a storm, should there not be calm? And would not the sun come out? And would not the world be more beautiful than before? Baldwin had an extraordinary career. He's very little known, but he's incredibly important on the subject I'm talking about this evening. Was Prime Minister in 1924 to 1929, and in 1935 to 1937. And between those dates, he was effectively Deputy Prime Minister. Like Margaret Thatcher, another Conservative Prime Minister, Baldwin successfully conveyed a personal vision with huge influence. He saw the post-war world as a fragile place, inherently unstable, in need of careful handling. He strove and succeeded to be a figure that rose above politics, trying to evoke images that he believed would unify the nation. And these images were traditional Christian images: charity, patience, respect, generosity of spirit. But they were all underpinned by the idea of rural heritage. The image of Britain that Baldwin encapsulated was one of him being the countryman. And Baldwin the countryman was a central part of his appeal, particularly in the early years of his premiership. This is Haresfield Beacon that was handed over to the National Trust in January 1931. And Baldwin was asked to come and mark the acquisition of it. And in his speech, which was published, he said, "I think it answers to a very deep and profound instinct of the British people. The country represents the internal values and the eternal traditions from which we must never allow ourselves to be separated." In June 1931, he unveiled another memorial stone, very keen on unveiling stones, this time at Old Sarum, the beautiful former site of Salisbury. And here he asked, what was the value of Old Sarum? The site value arrived at by any value can be but very small, but the value to us and to England is infinite. The spiritual value is beyond all computation. So here we have the leading politician of his age defining himself through the countryside. And it was Baldwin's government that set up a body called the Empire Marketing Board to promote imperial products worldwide. Its secretary was Sir Stephen Talents, who invented the concept of national projection, the conveyance of images about Britain that were to marry dynamic, forward-looking characteristics such as industry and tourism, universities, scientific research, with a more established group of icons: the monarchy, London buses, the Oxford and Cambridge boat race, and the countryside. And in 1937, under his influence, Britain sported a pavilion at the Paris International Exhibition. And this was intended to convey precisely this image. The building was partly modern and partly traditional. A white box, as you see, with curvaceous lines, but with Georgian-shaped windows, which you can't see in this. You have to see them on the back. And inside, there's quite a modern vision, I think you'll agree, on the outside. Inside, it contained an entirely traditional vision of England, with tennis, weekend cottages, shepherds in white smocks in 1937, and, wait for it, a cardboard cutout of Neville Chamberlain fishing. It was designed by the architect Oliver Hill, as you can see here at the bottom of this magazine picture here, but with significant input from Frank Pick, who I mentioned in my last lecture, the brains behind London Underground. So here you have it absolutely encapsulated, forwards and backwards. The Empire Pavilion expressed inside the reality of interwar England, the countryside, cottages, fresh air, and outside it attempted to make a concession to the modern style that many other countries were entering into in a much more wholehearted way. But that modernity was a minority interest in England. The mainstream was somewhere else entirely. Because, as we have seen, the post-war fashion was for miles and miles sprawling developments of half-timbered houses in the suburbs. Those with slightly more cultivated taste, I think, turned away from this oldie-worldy vision of England to the Georgian period, which was seen as being much more ordered, much simpler, a metropolitan aesthetic, restrained and well-mannered, that created a stylish modernism with some sort of ancestry. But it's very interesting, the great admiration for the Georgians, because I think there was a quite strong association that was made at the time between the post-war years and the years in which Georgian architecture flourished. And classical architecture in England, as I've made the point several times in this series of lectures, appealed to different generations for different reasons. The Georgians themselves had admired Georgian architecture because it brought them the feeling that they were imitating the architecture of Roman senators and generals, and they associated with these people very, very strongly. The Victorians associated with classical architecture, and I've made this point in this series of lectures, because they saw in these classical buildings the Medicis and the Gonzaga, the great merchant princes, and they saw themselves as merchant princes. And I think that the Edwardians admired the Georgians, and this is, of course, Admiralty Arch, which is built by the Edwardians, because I think they associated with a world in which the terraces of Georgian England were constructed, a world which existed in the immediate aftermath of a long, cruel European war, the Napoleonic Wars. It was a world of political and social turmoil that managed, despite all its complexities, to produce the ordered and elegant architectural expression of Georgian England. So I think Edwardians associated very strongly with Georgian architecture. And this architecture was promoted very strongly by the magazine Country Life, whose editor, Christopher Hussey, who lived at Scotney Castle here, another sort of romantic, amazing romantic vision, set out really to popularise Georgian buildings. And of course, this was at a time when Georgian architecture was very unpopular. Georgian squares, not this one, which is not Fitzroy, which is Bedford Square. This one wasn't being knocked down, but many others were being knocked down. This was the period when the Georgian group was founded. And Country Life itself set out to live what it was preaching. These are the new offices in Tavistock Square, designed for Country Life in immediate years just before the First World War, in a Georgian style. But after the war, this is what you get. This is Grosvenor Square. Miles and miles and miles of neo-Georgian building. Really, the dominant architectural expression in our towns and cities. These are a mixture of flats and offices. Wherever you go, these big neo-Georgian red brick blocks are everywhere. Such blocks of flats were despised by modernist architects who built the Isokon building, which we looked at earlier. They thought these buildings were backward-looking and historicist. But funnily enough, I think that at the time, modernist buildings were also regarded as a sort of historical curiosity. Now, this is a very funny thing to say, but I'm going to try and explain what I mean. And to explain what I mean, I just want to take you in my last 5 minutes to the seaside. Ever since the Prince Regent had built his marine pavilion in Brighton, the seaside sported buildings that were fun and fantasy. That's what it was all about. It enabled seaside visitors to escape from their mundane everyday lives and enter a magical world of the annual holiday. And after 1918, Victorian seaside towns built incredible sights. We've got the Blackpool Tower here. The Winter Gardens, and it's a bad picture, I'm afraid, but exotic interiors. These, of course, are late Victorian buildings. What happens, though, after 1918 is a new exotic style appears. They turn away from exotic styles from India, from Spain, from Mexico, and goodness knows where else. All the seaside architecture is really quite mad. They turn towards the fashionable French continental Riviera, and they turn to seagoing ocean liners. Working-class Britons now had no need to afford to go to the dangerous and morally suspect south of France, where people ate garlic and ate frog's legs. They had no need to go on cripplingly expensive upper-class cruises, because they could experience the sophistication from all this at home. Morecambe Bay, a working-class holiday resort for people who lived in Liverpool, acquired the Midland Hotel, bringing a glamorous foreign style to a Victorian town. Perhaps you might take a flat at Marine Court in Hastings. This is an advertisement for it. It's still there, built in 1937, which was described at the time as a liner on land. Or you might go to the movies in the cinema on the front at Margate, now the entrance to Dreamland, but when it was built in 1935, one of the first entertainment buildings in Britain to have one of these tall towers with a fin on it. This again is what I was talking about earlier, the horizontal and the vertical, and lots and lots and lots of cinemas adopt this, this style after Dreamland takes it on. And on your holiday, you would certainly want to bathe in one of the vast lidos constructed on the beaches of most resorts. Here is Saltdean Lido, built in 1938. So many of them have been demolished, this one survives. One of the most sophisticated of all the seaside lidos, consciously influenced, not seem to be given the next one, yeah, consciously influenced by aircraft an airport design. You probably can see it in that contemporary picture. The fascinating thing about this extensive use of modernist architecture at the seaside was that this was not seen as a serious style. The serious style were the houses in Grosvenor Square. They were Georgian. This is where the serious architecture was. This is where the money was. But in the coast, a new fantasy style was to join the other fantasy styles. A new sense of escapism. This wasn't real England, this was fun. Real England was rooted in the past. But there was perhaps just a tiny weeny hint of threat in these seaside structures. It was through leisure pursuits that many British people saw a huge threat of Americanization. Because by the 1920s, the successful films, the ones that people wanted to watch, were almost all American. So was the music, hot jazz, ragtime, foxtrot, eventually the Charleston, to which young people danced. And it was very consciously that the newly formed BBC acted as a bastion against creeping Americanization, championing British traditions in music, in comedy, and in crystallizing a sort of calendar of national events, from the sound of the first nightingale to the choristers of King's College Chapel singing on Christmas Eve. In 1932, 10 years after its foundation, the BBC commissioned its first purpose-built home, Broadcasting House, designed by George Valmeyer, a commercial architect who built a number of office blocks in the city. In the context of its neighbours, this was an uncompromisingly modern design, overwhelming All Souls Langham Place next door. In its height and in its Art Deco style, there is a hint of the American office block. But at its root, it has a Georgian rhythm to it. It has Georgian windows. I mean, these could virtually be Georgian sash windows. The disposition of windows are there. So here we have the BBC, the bastion against Americanisation. It too is backwards and it is forwards. This is the position in which English architecture found itself between the wars. It wasn't sitting on the fence, it wasn't uncomfortable, but it was distinctive, and it was representative of the society transformed by the terrible events of 1914 to 18. While the First World War did not mark a decisive break in English architecture, the Second World War was cataclysmic. So I would like to invite you to join me on the 6th of March to hear Coming to Terms with Modern Times, which will be about how architecture after 1945 went in a very different direction. Thank you.